All right, so let's talk about muscle tissue. So you have a lot of epithelial tissues to learn, right? A lot of connective tissues to learn. Fortunately, for muscle tissue, you only have to know 3, okay? So you need to know the big group, it's muscle tissue. You need to know specific tissue. Is it skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, or smooth muscle? Right? So this is skeletal muscle. So what I want you to know about this one is that if you see these long rectangular, essentially sheets with these lines in them, these lines are called striations that are more vertical lines. Okay, so, and then you see these elongated nuclei, and there's multiple nuclei per cell. All right, so if you see that, you're most likely going to be looking at skeletal muscle. And where do you find it? Muscle attached to the bones. Okay. What does it do? Moves your skeleton, right? Generates heat, protects your internal organs. Okay, but that's your skeletal muscle. Here's a microscope view of it. You'll get a chance to see that today. So again, long rows, very organized, vertical striations or lines, multiple nuclei per cell. Each of these, essentially, these rows is a separate cell. So there's lots of nuclei. Why do you have lots of nuclei? Why do you think you have lots of nuclei in a skeletal muscle fiber or skeletal muscle cell? What is DNA? What's I just gave you the answer. What's in the nucleus? DNA, right? What is DNA used for? So makes RNA, which makes proteins. Muscles are going to need lots of protein. Okay. Another view, higher magnification. Again, you see multiple nuclei. You can see the striations. Here's another view. Again, see the striations, multiple nuclei. Next type of muscle tissue is cardiac muscle tissue. Okay. Cardiac muscle tissue is only found in one location. Give you hints on the screen. Where is it? In the heart. Okay. These cells are also striated, but they're short and branched. Okay, not as organized. They don't have that clean row pattern like skeletal muscles. Single nucleus. Okay. And they are interconnected by these cells are interconnected here in what we call intercalated discs. All right, so if you see these light lines here connecting cardiac muscle cells, so you know it's cardiac muscle. These are intercalated discs. So you need to know that structure. All right, so in this one, the intercalated discs are staying dark. Okay, you see these lines sort of cut across the cardiac muscle fiber. You can see faint striations. Okay, you don't see nearly as many nuclei as you do in skeletal muscle, but you see these intercalated discs. You see intercalated discs, that is cardiac muscle. And yes, you do have to be a little creative because I know you may not have seen a lot of slides, so that may just look like a big mess to you. But the circles are nuclei. Those lines are intercalated discs. Another view. Again, you can see all these intercalated discs cutting across those cardiac muscle fibers. And they are branched. They're not just straight lines across. Last type of muscle, smooth muscle. Smooth muscle, these are short cells. They're spindle shaped, which means they're narrow and have points at the end. Single nucleus per cell. So the only one that is multinucleated is skeletal muscle. Where do you find smooth muscle? Walls of hollow organs, blood vessels. What does it do? It moves food, urine, reproductive tract secretions. Okay, monitors and controls the shape or diameter of the passageways in your respiratory system. Also regulates the diameter in your blood vessels. Another important point. Skeletal muscle is voluntary. You have to think to move your skeletal muscles typically. Your smooth muscle and your cardiac muscle are involuntary. All right, here's another view of smooth muscle. All right, so you have a circular layer here of smooth muscle, whereas here is more of a longitudinal layer. Okay, so it's different, it's cut differently. All right, both smooth muscle though. Okay. They just sort of, the fibers run in different directions. And here you can see the spindle-shaped cells pretty well. They're narrow. Also, no striations, okay? Smooth muscle, no striations, okay? So, to summarize, skeletal, cardiac, smooth, all right, so the nuclei per cell. Skeletal muscle is many nuclei per cell. Cardiac and smooth, one. Okay. Are they voluntary? Skeletal muscle is voluntary. Cardiac and smooth muscle are involuntary. So the answer is no. All right, how to be striated. Yes, for skeletal muscle. Yes. For cardiac muscle. No. For smooth muscle. Where do you find them? So the skeletal muscle is attached to the skeleton. Cardiac muscle is found at the heart. Smooth muscle is found at the blood vessels. And walls of hollow organs. And since I don't really have a place to put it here, cardiac muscle has intercalated discs. Okay? And if you need to come up here later, we'll have microscope time. If you need to come up here and see it better, you can. But does this help summarize some of that for you? So this says blood vessels in the walls of hollow organs. All right. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes, talk with the person at your table about what you learned about types of muscle tissue. All right. So nervous tissue, you have basically two categories that you need to know. You need to know the neurons. You know the neuroglia. Okay, for the neurons, they have a basic structure. So the big part of the neuron is called the cell body. Okay. So you'll also have on that neuron an axon. And here's a drawing of a neuron. And axons carry information. They conduct information to other cells. Your neuron will also have dendrites. And the dendrites receive information. Okay, so that's a big difference between the two. So
you said dendrites receive information and the axons what?
So axons send information. Dendrites receive information. So dendrites receive the information and goes to the cell body. Then the cell body then sends information through the axon to some other part of the body. So in here you can see like the big circle that's colorless is the nucleus. The small circle is the nucleolus. Okay, I remember we covered this already, but remember the nucleus is basically like your container for your DNA. The nucleolus is where the ribosomes get made. Okay. Also on the end of the axon down here, you have these little endings. These are called synaptic terminals. Okay, that's another thing you'd be responsible for knowing. So these synaptic terminals might touch another neuron, they might touch some muscle, they might touch some other part of your body. But they are called synaptic terminals. It's a fancy way of saying nerve endings, but we don't say nerve endings, we say synaptic terminals. Okay. Some more views of neurons. All right, so you have lots of dendrites. It's a little bit larger. This is an axon. So you're most likely going to be asked to tell the difference between an axon and a dendron on a model, not on a slide. You would probably have to tell, if I showed you a microscope slide like this or a picture like this, you need to tell me either A, if I ask for a big group, nervous tissue or neural tissue. If I ask for specific tissue, you tell me the neurons. Does that make sense? Big category, specific tissue. All right, another view. And here's your axon, and here are your dendrites. There's your cell body. You can kind of see a nucleus there. Okay, your other type of tissue in the neurotissue is the neuroglia. And they support the neurons. Okay? So what do? They maintain the tissue's physical structure. They repair the tissue framework after injury. They perform phagocytosis, which is eating other things that are bad for you, like microorganisms. They can provide nourishment and nutrients to the neurons. And they can regulate the composition of the interstitial fluid that surrounds the neurons. Remember, interstitial fluid's another way of saying like extracellular fluid. Okay. Yes. Exactly. So if you think about it like from a healthcare perspective, you know, you have your doctors and your nurses, they'd be like your neurons, and then you have, you know, so maybe you have a lot of other healthcare, either healthcare professionals, or even like you have healthcare administrators who run all the money to make sure the doctors and nurses and lab techs and EMTs can all do their jobs. Or like in education, you have teachers, but there's a whole lot of other people who work in a school to make sure the teachers can teach the students. Okay. All right, here's another view of the neuroglia. So hopefully you can look at this and tell, A, this is not epithelium. B, this is not connective tissue. C, this is not muscle tissue. So it's nervous tissue, but these are not neurons. So it's neuroglia. And these kind of black squiggly line things hopefully look a little bit like these in terms of shape. Okay. All right. So I'll give you a couple minutes to talk about nervous tissue and what you learned. All right, so with body membranes, kind of builds on what we learned with the different categories of tissues. So we have 4 basic body membranes. So we've got mucous membranes, serous membranes, cutaneous membranes, and synovial membranes. Mucous, serous, cutaneous, synovial. All right, so for mucous membranes, basically you have mucous glands that secrete mucus. Okay, makes sense. You'll see this in the digestive tract, respiratory tract, urinary tract, reproductive tract. All right. Here's one way you would know that you have a mucous membrane. Right there. This is a goblet cell. Okay, so if you see a goblet cell, it's a mucous membrane. And what do goblet cells produce? Mucus. How do you even know that? So for serous membranes, these line ventral body cavities. Remember, that's the front of the body. So like your abdominal pelvic cavity, thoracic cavity. So this includes peritoneal, pleural, and pericardial. So remember, peritoneal lines your abdominal cavity. Your pleural is your lining for your lungs. And your pericardial cavity, lining around your heart. Your serous membrane is how you know it's a serous membrane, is this thing right here, this little layer there at the top. And it's called transudate. I'll make it a little bigger. Transudate. Okay, so if you see that, it's a serous membrane. Or if you see that picture on a practical or whatever, and they ask you, what is that? You're going to tell me it's transudate. Okay, cutaneous membrane, also known as skin. Covers your outer surface of your body, right? Okay. Made up of epithelium, connective tissue underneath. So if you see that something looks like this, it's cutaneous membrane or skin. All right, you also have synovial membranes. And they line joint cavities, produce synovial fluid in your joints. So they line joint cavities. And produce synovial fluid. All right, so here, this joint here, you've got cartilage on the ends of these bones, also helps cushion the joint, so those bones aren't hitting each other. You also have synovial fluid in here to cushion the joint. All right, if you look at this lining of that membrane, you've got epithelium, you've got areolar connective tissue, you've got some adipose tissue, and all that makes up your synovial membrane. And it basically lines that joint cavity, produces synovial fluid. Okay. So again, mucous membranes, serous membranes, cutaneous membranes, synovial membranes. Okay. All right, little focus here on that mucous membrane. Again, see the goblet cells. Goblet cells secrete mucus. Okay. So here's your goblet cells. This layer here is what's being secreted, is the mucus. Okay. So if you see the goblet cells, it's a mucous membrane. Serous membranes, again, they line those ventral body cavities, and they have that layer of transudate, okay, on the surface of that membrane. And again, you see transudate, serous membrane. Or if you tell you it's a serous membrane, they ask you what that secretion is, it's transudate. And your cutaneous membrane covers your outer surface, has the epithelium and the connective tissue underneath. All right, another characteristic for membranes is the presence of a basement membrane. So cells attach to each other to stay together, but they also need an anchor at the bottom to attach to. And that's the basement membrane. And basement membrane's got two layers. The layer connecting to the cells is the basal lamina, and the layer connecting to the connective tissue underneath is reticular lamina. But you do need to know those two terms, or three terms: the basement membrane and its components, the basal lamina and the reticular lamina. Again, that basal lamina is more superficial, it connects to the cells. Reticular lamina connects the basal lamina to the connective tissue underneath. All right, another view here of synovial membranes. Again, you can see the synovial fluid that's being produced. Remember, it's lining the joint cavities. Okay, it's lining the joint cavities. So that's the synovial membrane. All right. Give you a couple minutes to talk to your neighbor about what you learned about the body membranes. All right, so with the integumentary system, and this kind of syncs up with what we're covering in lecture this week. So you got your cutaneous membrane, which is composed of your dermis and your epidermis. Okay, epidermis is at the surface. Okay, epidermis is deep to that. All right, so you have the hypodermis, which is deep to the dermis. Let's see. Those are your basic layers, okay? One thing I do want to point out from lecture, I mentioned the epidermal ridges and the dermal papillae. So the blue dips, those are the epidermal ridges. And the pink sort of indentations going up, those are your dermal papillae. Okay. All right, accessory structures. So projecting through the epidermis, you'll see hair shafts. Okay, you see a pores here for sweat gland ducts. Here's another sweat gland duct, and it's projecting the sweat through that pore. All right, so with the hair, so here's the hair follicle. Okay. There's an erector pili muscle that can help make it stand up depending on if you're sensing something. It's the sebaceous gland. It secretes oil into this hair follicle. Okay, you have different nerve endings here. So you got the tactile or Meissner's corpuscles and the lamellated or Pacinian corpuscles. They are basically receptors. So the laminated or Pacinian corpuscles will sense pressure. And the tactile corpuscles are sensitive to touch. And that should make sense because they're sort of closer to the surface. So they're going to sense touch really well. The lamellated or Pacinian corpuscles are a little deeper. So if you're pressing down on it, you're going to sense that pressure. And the lamellated or Pacinian corpuscles to me look kind of like onions. So they have like the rings. Whereas these just kind of look like small balloons. Okay. Here's the sweat gland and the sweat gland duct. Okay, another nerve fiber. Okay, those are some of the structures that you'll need to get familiar with. Okay, these are blood vessels. Going through that reticular layer. The dermis. Here's another view of those epidermal ridges on the edge, on sort of the inner surface or deep surface of the epidermis. And the more indentations here are the dermal papillae of the dermis. Okay. But yes, you would be expected to be able to identify epidermal ridges or dermal papillae on a picture or a slide or a model. Remember, epidermis has epidermal ridges, dermal papillae is in the dermis. All right. Layers or structure of the epidermis. Okay, so your more superficial layer, your stratum corneum. It's thin layer that's kind of colorless or white, stratum lucidum. This layer just deep to that is the stratum granulosum. It's just the kind of thin layer here. This thicker layer is your stratum spinosum, and just kind of the lining of that more pinkish purple area is your stratum basal. And just deep to that is your basement membrane, and then your dermis. And remember, this is thick skin because it has all 5 layers. Okay. If it only has 4 layers, then it's thin skin. And also, you know it's thick skin because it has so much stratum corneum. Okay. So we'll look at that again in another slide, so we'll come back to it. So in the nail, as you know, nails grow away from your finger. Okay, you probably have seen this little white spot. It looks like a little half moon. Another word for moon is lunar, so we call this a lunula. The part of the nail that sometimes people put polish on is the nail body. The skin fold near the lunula is called eponychium. Okay, if you do a cross section, so you can see the nail body here, just beneath or just deep to the nail body structure we call the nail bed. All right, and inside the nail is the bone, the digit or phalange. All right. So in the longitudinal view, again, you can see the bone here. It's your nail body, underneath it, again, nail bed. Okay. So the skin fold by the lunula is the eponychium again. All right, so this layer of skin, more toward the surface, is the epidermis. Deep to that is the dermis. Now you have a little fold of skin at the area kind of where you clip your nails, but basically underneath that, there's an area called a hyponychium. Hypo, low, right? So you have eponychium and hyponychium. So if you see a nail model or a picture of a nail, you want to be able to identify those parts. All right, thick skin, again, another view of thick skin. You got your epidermis, your dermis. You see some blood vessels. You got a large hypodermis. Okay, here's thin skin. Okay, you don't see near, in comparison, the epidermis is much thicker than what you see here. Okay. Now this is 40x, so it is, but you would think with a 40x, if you go to 200x, everything would be expanded, right? But because it's thin skin, it still looks really small in comparison. All right, so here's another view. You can see a lumen or a hair follicle. And these little bubble areas there, these are sebaceous glands. Okay, they're secreting their oil into the hair follicle. So what I would want you to be able to identify is if you see something that looks like this, you should know these are sebaceous glands. All right, so going back to the skin, you got to remember what this big layer is. Stratum starts with a C. Stratum corneum. So, all right, so let's see. See if I can do this. Well. My handwriting's not that great on this, but try it this way instead.
I'm sorry, I struggle with that.
All right. So then what's this one? The little white area, stratum lucidum. All right, what about just underneath it? Stratum granulosum. All right, what about this one? Stratum spinosum. And what about this one? Stratum basal or stratum germinativum. Okay. All right. So, and I said in the lecture, but in case any of you are not in my lecture, the acronym, CLGSB. So, all right, so come, let's get some burgers, right? So, may help you remember the different layers. So, all right, well, that is a lecture. So I'm going to give y'all some time to kind of go back over integumentary system, and I also want those of you here in lab, go look at the slides at your tables. If you don't have slides at your table, let's kind of rotate to a table that does. And once we get them ready, then we can all rotate and look at everybody else's slides.